So let's say you're bringing the Tomlin Tour to Atlanta. Your PA's flown, your band's coming out on stage. How do you approach a mix?
Well, it really starts before the band even gets there. When we're setting the stage, I'm already thinking in terms of what I'm going to need to have happen. For example, we're running cables, we're setting mics. I'm real aware and cognizant of mic placement. We have a guitar tech who's setting up Guitar World, so as he's kind of making sure everything's in tune and set up right, I'm listening to guitar amps, making sure the tone is what we need. So it's knowing the musicians, knowing the music can help you anticipate what you're going to need things to sound like. But for drums, for example, I'm trying to make sure that the drums are tuned properly, so that when Travis comes on and hits the stage, he's not having to tweak and tweak and tweak to make sure everything's right. So if heads need to be changed, or if toms need to be tuned, that's happening at that time. So before the band even gets there, we're trying to approach everything with, again, it's about that relationship. So when they come in, we're as prepared for them as they can be, so they can do what they need to do to make the day happen great.
So your stage is pinned, your drums are tuned, guitar mics are placed. What does sound check look like for you?
Well, for this particular tour, the band comes on stage before Chris does, just to make sure that everything is right for their ears. And so they're going to come on stage and they'll start playing a song or playing a groove or just kind of playing whatever. So the monitor engineer is getting their in-ears right, and if there's any changes they need and all that. But out front, I've got faders up and I'm just starting to tweak. So I'll start with drums, and typically, I'll start with the kick drum and work my way down, just because that's the way it's lined up on the console. Unlike some people, though, I don't know where this started, whether it's just too many people going to rock shows or what, but somehow people have come to think that the kick drum is the most important thing in a mix. And I just don't agree. I mean, if we're worship leaders and we're trying to communicate what's happening from a worship standpoint, what the worship leader's doing is most important most of the time. So, if Chris is out there, I'm going to have the vocal up all the time so that I can hear how his vocal and his acoustic, or whatever he's doing, if it's a keyboard, how it sits relative to everything else. But in terms of drums, let's just go back to drums for a minute. I'll start with the kick drum and just make sure nothing's out of control. Typically in our tour, we're in bigger arenas, and so sometimes the low end can get a little too boomy. So I'll just make sure that the subs are kind of firing properly and that there's not too much kind of resonance around 50, 60 hertz, that kind of thing. Keeping in mind, though, that when people get in the room, it is going to be a little different. But I try to keep the low end kind of as tight as I can. I really like a hi-fi sound for my drums, so when I'm working with toms, I'm typically cutting quite a bit, around 500, 400, just try to get rid of some of that boxiness. Boosting a little bit of low end, kind of boosting quite a bit of high end. But as far as EQ in general, my approach is to cut rather than to add, just so that we don't have weird build up and things just get out of control too quickly. When you sit down at the console and you think, well, I need to add this and add this and add this, pretty soon your gain structure is all weird and you're adding way more than you need to be. So I'm always thinking in terms of cutting, EQ. A snare drum, I really want to have a nice crack of the drum. Going back to the relationship part, I remember a specific story from a couple weeks ago. Travis was on stage and we were in this bigger arena, and for some reason that day his snare drum, the ring of the drum was really kind of standing out, and it happened to be ringing at a C sharp, and that was the note that was just kind of sticking out, C sharp above middle C. And so I was just, it was really kind of clashing, because the song that they were playing happened to be in D. And so they're hitting the one of, the tonic of the key, and every time they hit the one, the snare drum just sounds like, what is wrong with that snare? Well, it was because of the way it was ringing with the music. So because of the relationship that Travis and I have, I was able to go, hey, can we muffle that a little bit? Can we maybe tune it just a little bit differently so that it's not rubbing so much? Well, sometimes, especially in a church setting, church sound man walks up to the drummer, who he may not know very well, and says, that drum is doing this. Well, the drummer's hearing, oh, you don't like my drums. You don't like me, because that's what I do, you know. So then there's this big relational battle that starts happening. It's like, no, I just need you to tweak it a little bit. Can I help you? Can we work together? You know, so that kind of scenario is why the relationship is so important, because it truly is affecting the sound out front. And so he was able to just kind of put a little bit of muffle on the snare drum, totally went away. After that song in the set, he took it off and it never was a problem again. So it was just that day, that room, that situation, something was weird. We were able to address it quickly and tweak it, and it was fine. So that's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but moving on to the rest of the band. Once the drums are feeling good, then I'll typically add guitars just to make sure that, again, just balance-wise and tone-wise, there's nothing that's rubbing, that's getting out of control. I find myself sometimes bringing the bass guitar in later and later during sound check. I really, again, part of it is being in arenas. I think the low end can get out of control pretty quickly. A couple weeks ago I tried an experiment. Let me keep the bass guitar out until the very end and just bring in enough to where you feel it. And don't let it dominate. Don't try to make it be something. And it was amazing how well it worked. It was like, oh wow, there's the low end, there's the feel, there's the thing. So it's not necessarily knowing when I walk in, okay, I've got to filter the bass at 40 hertz, and I've got to boost 2K, and I've got to boost 5K to get the point that I need. I mean, there's some of that, but for me, I approach it from a musical perspective first. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, how can I make this feel right, sound like the record? How can I make it kind of just feel where it needs to be right?
So you mentioned something about the worship leader being the most important thing in the mix. Tell me what tools you use and how you craft the vocal sound to fit that mission.
Okay. Well, unlike some people, if there's a worship leader on stage during sound check, or the singer, you know, whatever the context is, I'll typically have the vocal up the whole time, so that as I'm working on drums, as I'm working on other instruments, I'm always kind of shaping the sound relative to the vocal. Whether it's EQ or compression or panning, I'm always trying to think, okay, how can I make the vocal be the most present aspect of the mix? So for example, with Chris, he's on stage most of the time with an acoustic guitar. Well, most people, you know, acoustic guitar is a mono instrument, his vocal's a mono instrument, we're going to pan them all dead center. Well, sometimes with his vocal range, his acoustic gets in the way of the vocal a little bit. So sometimes I'll have to pan his acoustic just slightly to the right or slightly to the left, depending on what else is happening during the mix, during the song. So just being aware of placement, being aware of EQ. I typically don't use a lot of compression. I feel like a lot of, especially, you know, when you go from a hard and fast worship song to a more contemplative, intimate worship song, I want to be able to have that dynamic range happen in the mix. And so I think too much compression sometimes kills that. It's easy for that to just sort of become this flat kind of, let's see how loud we can get it all the way through kind of thing. It's why CDs aren't very appealing these days, is because everybody's trying to make it as loud as you can. Well, worship music shouldn't be loud all the time, you know, so we need to have the ability to let it breathe and let things kind of come and go and ebb and flow. So I don't use a lot of compression. EQ, in terms of a vocal, I really try to know how each voice sounds individually, so I don't have a standard approach for a vocal. I will use a de-esser on Chris, and I'll, you know, cut some upper mid frequencies. I'll typically filter the vocal, you know, high pass filter pretty high, because in a live setting, you know, there's not a whole lot of information that we need below 200 hertz, and so I'm shelving things pretty strong in the low range. That helps with, you know, guitar amp bleed and bass amp bleed and those kinds of things. You know, but I'm really always trying to be aware of having that vocal sit pretty, I mean, not way out front, but, you know, he is trying to, you know, lead people. And so I think it needs to be, you know, predominant. Now, in a song, if, again, going back to knowing the material and knowing the music, I've got my finger on the fader for the lead vocal, and I've got my finger on either the keyboards or the guitars, depending on what needs to happen during a song. For example, if there's a 2-bar turnaround between the first chorus and the second verse, and there's a guitar lead that's going to happen, I'm aware of that, so that I'm always kind of riding the faders, so that that guitar part that he's worked so hard to craft is communicated. Or if there's a keyboard lick, for example, the song Indescribable. Everybody knows that song. Everybody does it probably. You know, the piano lick, ba-da-ba-da-do-da-do-da. That's the signature lick of the song. And so when Matt is playing that, you know, I've got my finger on his faders so that every time that happens, I'm aware of what's going on. So I've got, you know, one finger on him, one finger on Chris's vocal, and just kind of massaging it, you know, throughout the song. I think that's really important, to be aware of what's coming up next. You know, if there's a guitar solo after a bridge or after a chorus, you know, we need to make sure that that's heard. That's our job.